Well, here we are. Kelsey Hightower, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you?
I am fantastic in Berlin, Civo Navigate.
Yeah.
And just finished up my fireside chat, walking the floor, seeing companies like yours. People always ask me what happens after the wave.
Yeah.
I think it's companies like yours that bring it to shore, right? Got to mature this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It's fun when it starts, but the hard work is finishing it.
You know, in your fireside chat this morning, there were a lot of bites that I hung on to real well. But one of the topics that I wanted to just start with you on is about the complexity of cloud native. At Konstruct, our Kubernetes open source platform is trying to solve this problem that we see in the space. That, if you look at the just look at the booths that are at the clouds, and you can see a lot of where the pain is. And you mentioned that the industry will build and progress until there's a point of it being too painful, and then the abstraction's needed. And I feel like cloud native has been there. People talk about Kubernetes like it's very complicated, and while that's perhaps fair, it's not Kubernetes itself that's complex. It's the broad span of all these cloud-native products that now all of a sudden can work together really well, and you have to have that domain knowledge, and with each tool, with each layer, it just becomes more and more and more, and then you start building platforms, you start building platform teams. And we feel like at Kubernetes, there needs to be something like you were describing, something that can reduce that barrier and make it easier and make it more approachable. Do you have thoughts about just like what the right ways are to manage that complexity? Is it just an inevitability that that abstraction is coming just because the pain is there? Give me your thoughts on that, if you would.
I think the key to the question is there won't be one thing. This is where everyone struggles.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, there should be a thing, like there be one that just makes it simple.
Yeah.
Like, let's just use it in another way. There should be one restaurant.
Sure.
Why do we need Italian restaurants and Thai restaurants? How many burger places do we need?
Right.
And there's a reason multiple exist. There's a reason why there's a McDonald's in Germany, Berlin, Frankfurt, right? Some people need for locality to get there easier and quicker.
Yep.
Some people are vegetarians.
Right.
And so Burger King is off the menu. And I think that's the way it is. There's 9 billion people. There's millions of companies. No one's going to agree. And the good thing about where we are, you don't have to agree.
Right.
And so when we disagree, when it comes to software, just like cooking, you can make your own version of the thing.
Yeah.
And I think the hardest thing still, I was on vacation for a couple of weeks just recently, and the hardest decision is where we eating. Not we got to cook it, not what the recipe is, what stove to use. No, where should we go?
Yeah.
Think about how much time it takes to get consensus for a family to decide where to eat. And then when you get there, the waitress is like, hey, do I need to come back? Do you need a few more minutes?
Right.
Like, yeah, we haven't all decided because we all want something different. And we're not even cooking. I think for platform engineers that are doing the cooking
Yep.
in a kitchen, trying to satisfy the appetite of a whole organization that ain't agreeing on nothing,
Yeah.
that's when it gets complex. So I think companies like yours show up and say, look, just like the restaurant owner, here's our menu. We're a little bit flexible. We can tune the spice level.
Yep.
We can add something. We have a vegetarian section, but it may be not as big as our main sweet spot. And I think the hardest thing as a founder or someone running the business is that when do you say no?
Right.
Complexity creeps in when we don't say no enough.
Right.
And I think that's when we start adding that one more flag, that one more feature, support one more thing from the CNCF landscape, and then it gets to the same spot we just left.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really sharp observation. I heard you once describe exactly that. Once I can't remember which tool it was that you were working on. Was it etcd? Were you working on?
Yeah, I was at CoreOS, so maybe one of those tools.
Yeah, and somebody propose to you, why don't you support this particular technology?
Oh, ConfD.
ConfD, that's what it was.
I had just left Puppet Labs, configuration management's all the rave, promise theory, Mark Burris, all these things. And as someone who used Puppet in production for years and then got to go work at the company behind it,
Right.
I remember leaving Puppet in the world of containers, in the world of Golang, Terraform, this new way of thinking. I remember building this very small configuration management tool called ConfD.
Yeah.
It pulled its configuration from etcd instead of config files on disk or some Puppet DSL. And I remember, I was like, that's all I really need for this to work. Key values get translated into templates and distributed.
Yeah.
That's what you need in the new world. And I remember supporting multiple backends, which was a mistake. People on Amazon was like, support our Amazon key value store. You're like, sure. Support console. Okay, it's key value.
Yep.
So I make an abstraction, and eventually I remember, and the HashiCorp were great contributors. They came out with Vault. I was like, guys, we're going too far.
Yeah.
To support Vault, this other thing and this other thing, we're getting well beyond it. And I said no. And I remember they went off and created console template and announced it. It was on Hacker News, and people were like, oh, this is a ripoff of Kelsey's CompD. Why didn't you all work with him? And I was like, yo, this is the CompD maintainer and founder here. They gave me lots of contributions, and they did what they were supposed to. I said no, and they created their own thing. I inspired HashiCorp
Right.
to create a tool
Right.
based on an idea I had. Nothing's wrong with that. And I think the hardest thing to do as a founder or a maintainer is to draw that line. Because when you say no, that means you're creating an opportunity for someone else to say yes.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's exactly right. And you know, we struggle with that. Our platform is trying to accommodate the needs of everybody, whoever you are. If you're running software, we would like you to leverage our platform to run your software. And there's decisions that have to be made. What Git providers, what cloud providers, what GitOps engine? And the GitOps engine's a tough one. The Git providers, you know, you can kind of swap them in and out. It's not that impactful. You change the GitOps engine, that's the heart of your operations and orchestration.
Kubernetes made a very, very good decision to have first-class extensions.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand why that was so valuable. Nginx doesn't have easy first-class extensions, meaning back in the day, you could create an Nginx plugin, but you may not have access to the core system like configuration or the API. So you got to do something in the midst of an HTTP request, but you couldn't do what Nginx Enterprise could do.
Yeah.
So there was a second-class citizen of plugins. I think Terraform was kind of the same way in some ways. You could make a cloud provider, but you really couldn't necessarily change HCL, the configuration language.
Right.
But then Kubernetes comes out and says, everything will have this first-class API, the CRD, Custom Resource Definition.
Yeah.
If you make that, then you get kubectl, and all the other machinery to a large degree works the same. And I think that one decision meant that we could say no, and you didn't get forced to leave.
Exactly.
You didn't have to go from Mesos to Kubernetes, Swarm to Nomad.
Right.
You can just say, I'll make my own CRD, I'll make my own control loop, and I'll extend Kubernetes that way. But the dope part about doing that is the next person that wanted to use that, kubectl apply, still works.
Yep.
GitOps still works.
Yep.
And I think that was the game changer that a lot of people didn't realize it until they saw the ecosystem explode and somehow stay compatible.
Right, right. Yeah, let me ask your opinions on GitOps. Do you feel like GitOps, I saw the question once posted, is GitOps the only way to run Kubernetes? I have a very selfish opinion on it. I would like to know your opinion about GitOps, and is there a world where GitOps is not the right implementation for your Kubernetes ecosystem?
So I think fundamentally, Kubernetes introduces a type system to a world where it was just like a big dynamic programming language. My Python people will know exactly what I'm talking about. Is it a list? Is it a map? Is it a string? We won't know until you process it. And if you process the wrong thing, good luck. But it gave you a lot of flexibility. So this is why bash scripting, SSH for loops worked so well in the dynamic infrastructure world.
Yeah.
You can SSH to a Debian server or a Red Hat server. And you will find out when you get there whether it's yum or apt-get.
Yeah.
But in the Kubernetes world, it's a little bit more rigid. You have to define the API and scope. to the degree that there's now a type system. So now that we have this real type system, you can describe a thing.
Yeah.
And so the way you describe things in Kubernetes, I know everyone complains about YAML. As a human, you still need to articulate what you want.
Right.
That could be XML, it could be TOML, it don't matter. You still need to articulate what you want. And so Kubernetes comes out with this data model. So the first thing I saw was, oh, we can finally do promise theory. Instead of having Bash to Ruby to Puppet DSL, you finally have a data format that can be patched, it can be diffed,
Yep.
and you can run it through a pipeline. There's another place where that works well is that you can check in a thing, check out a thing, and it roughly be the same.
Yeah.
They have the same SHA, this data format. And so when you think about what GitOps is, Kubernetes is not a system of record. This is where I think a lot of people went wrong. And it's so funny, it's the same lesson we learned in config management. If you SSH to a live server and start making changes, then that lives and dies with the server.
Right.
If you start running kubectl apply against a live cluster, then those changes live and die with the cluster. And a lot of people started doing backup solutions,
Yep.
dump in the Kubernetes YAML, trying to decide, do I keep this set of metadata or is this cluster specific?
Right.
That's just probably not the most optimal approach. The thing is, since Kubernetes is not a system of record, it shouldn't be the system of truth if you want to make it reproducible. So ideally, you check in all the metadata you need to get the world that you want.
Right.
That's the key. So where does GitOps come in? So I say all that to set the foundation. GitOps is this concept that you will follow this workflow as strict as possible. Everything gets checked in, and then there will be something that pulls that thing and makes it so. The problem is you can't describe everything you want to do that way. This is where GitOps falls apart. For example, some people say, we're going to create a CI/CD system based on the Kubernetes protocol and API.
Okay.
So let's say I have a pipeline. You define it with some CRD. Build pipeline, and here are the 5 things. It should do this step, and this step. Since it's declarative, you can't be too specific. You got to just be defining inputs.
Right.
What's happening due to that input?
Yeah.
How do you say to a system like that, run the pipeline again?
Right.
You can't do imperative things easily.
Right.
You can try to touch a timestamp, but the timestamp is not part of the API.
Right.
It's a declarative thing that should be repeatable. So if I say as a developer, run this pipeline again, how would you do it?
Right.
So then you get people doing weird stuff like touch a manifest and bump a timestamp on a key value pair
Right.
and metadata. See, now you found yourself outside the bounds
Right.
of what Kube is. So in my idea is that GitOps is great for sameness.
Right.
Just do a sameness check. I need 12 of these apps. So that means if you need 12 of them, then you can hard code replica equal 12.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get 12 in every cluster is deployed. But what happens when you don't have sameness? Just to put this in concrete details, autoscaler. That is not a sameness.
Yep.
That's a rule.
Right.
I can have 3 to 12. Then you should leave the replica count off of the main object so that this thing can take ownership of that field.
Right.
Is that GitOps?
It's a good question. It's gray area.
But this is why I think people should not be so dogmatic. Check in your state the best you can.
Right.
Be very clear about ownership. Sometimes the autoscaler should own the replica count.
Yep.
And it should not find its way in Git. Therefore, you're not doing GitOps for the autoscaler because some other tool may be doing it.
Yeah.
And it's okay to mix and match. Just be clear about ownership.
Yep. Very cool. Let me ask you this. You've been in infrastructure forever. And all the way back to the Puppet days, and I'm sure before that even, right? And the evolution of infrastructure has always fascinated me. You know, in fact, I just finished a talk a second ago talking about the old days. And when you used to have to issue a ticket and say, I would like a server to be racked for me, please. And I needed to have these specs. And by the time it shows up and is available to you, your estimations are all different, you know? The industry felt that pain. And the public cloud came out, and we all kind of flocked in that direction. And then all of a sudden, it was the responsibility of the engineer. It kind of shifted left, that discipline of ownership of your machinery, and it was great. And then in comes Kubernetes, and around the same time frame, in is coming Terraform and real infrastructure as code, and then. We're starting to hoist that up, and it's no longer just a command line tool that you can use to run infrastructure, but you can have it managed as a control plane and make sure that your desired state becomes your actual state. Where does infrastructure as code go from here? Is there even a future where infrastructure as code doesn't fit the bill? Does it go more Kubernetes oriented so that you can take advantage of the control loop? There's great technologies like Crossplane coming out. There's operators that will run your Terraform for you. It seems like there's all these different ways to go about managing machinery. Where do we go from there?
I think the reason why I like looking at like the history, software has always been infrastructure as code. It literally is what it is.
Yeah.
We have real hardware, which is infrastructure as hardware.
It is.
Right? So you commit to that thing and that's it. Infrastructure as code is like that first compiler. Some people even call it infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? This thing that takes input and turns it into things that run on some chip or CPU.
Yeah.
So software has always been infrastructure as code because that's literally the only way to do it. The thing is like, what's the machinery behind it?
Yeah.
That's what we've all been playing with. So in Mark Burris, I think he was based in the UK when he wrote it. I met him in Oslo. And he wrote this thing about promise theory. This idea that you would define something as it relates to infrastructure, and then some control loop will make it so. And the earlier implementations of it were things like CF Engine, which was a company built around his ideas, and I think he helped kind of start it and lead that. But if you looked at the CF Engine code, over time, it got closer to bash scripting.
Yeah.
Than it did to the holy grail of just a data model influencing a control loop. But even that was like earlier signs of this infrastructure as code because you use code to do it. Some would argue the bash scripts that were running on your machines were you defining your infrastructure via code. I think the discipline of saying this declarative thing that we worked our way towards from Puppet, Chef, Ansible, to then Kubernetes, but the imperative loop is still there. I think that's the part people get lost. If you look at a Kubernetes controller, it's full of if statements and for loops and all the imperative things that we would rule out from being declarative infrastructure. But it's still there. It's just that the API now is declarative that feeds the control loop. We have a better framework for describing infrastructure, funny enough, not as code, as data.
Yeah.
Infrastructure as data seems to be the thing that took us to the next level. So we've already went through the transition. Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Bash, infrastructure as code.
Yeah.
Kubernetes is infrastructure as data.
Right.
That gets interpreted by the code. So now that you have infrastructure as data, what do you get? You get pipelines. You get data pipelines. You can do select pod where blah equals, and it works. I can take Helm, written in one language, produce a manifest, use a different tool like Customize to patch it, and they will just work. Why? Because we have an intermediate representation of data. So now we're in infrastructure as data.
Yeah.
Given a type system to infrastructure. That to me is the big leap. Dynamic infrastructure to typed infrastructure. And once we agree on the types, we can have 1 million implementations.
Right. And with the extensibility of Kubernetes, is there even a ceiling? Let me ask you that directly. So Kubernetes blew my mind. I started my Kubernetes adventure in a DevOps shop, arguing against it. That's how my story began. I'm old enough to have seen a handful of hype cycles in my day, and it felt like one. There was obvious hype from it. I wasn't deep enough into it to really truly grok why it was so impactful until I ended up leaving that job. My next job, my CTO said, well, we're doing Kubernetes and you're in charge, so good luck. So I had to learn the ins and outs of Kubernetes. And what was so magical about Kubernetes. It solved a problem I had spent my whole career trying to solve. How do you get software installed in a uniform way? And Kubernetes made that a reality in a way that really I didn't think anything was even close. And with that approach, the Kubernetes ecosystem has evolved and vendors have bought in and the community has grown and the industry has centralized on Kubernetes. And I can't see where the story ends. It's extensible enough that it allows you to build anything that you want and extend it in any way that you want. You could have it turn on your toaster if you were crazy enough. Where is the ceiling for Kubernetes?
I mean, think about it. We're in the industry that's in the business of selling stuff.
Yeah.
And in order to sell stuff, it has to be compatible. You can't sell cell phone cases unless the cell phones they case are predictable. This is why Apple sends them the rough spec, what the new phone's going to be, so they can make the cases. Mm-hmm. We have an ecosystem. So our ecosystem requires a level of consensus. Microsoft supports a thing called Kubernetes, so does Google, so does Amazon. So we get to have an ecosystem now. Mm-hmm. So if you're in the business of selling compute, I don't care if the API happens to be Kubernetes based or not, it's going to support consumption. It's one of those things that rises all tides because you can have lots of airlines, a couple of airliners that make them Boeing, Airbus. So I think that's kind of where we are in the Kubernetes landscape. What can you do with Kubernetes? The reason why it feels like there's no ceiling, because Kubernetes, if you really think about what it is, there's a few out-of-the-box control loops. One of them takes a manifest, pulls containers down, and picks a server for them to run on. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. So what is a valid Kubernetes cluster? etcd and the API server and none of the other control loops. It won't do anything. That API server will understand a set of types, kubectl applied just to those two components, and it will work. Nothing will happen. Your pod will sit there in pending mode forever. There'll be no nodes registered, but you have a valid Kubernetes cluster doing absolutely nothing.
Right.
The moment you add one of the out-of-the-box controllers, you can have it deploy a pod, but there'll be no nodes for it to deploy. So we'll just keep trying, telling you, there's nowhere for this to go. You can register a node, and that controller will say, I have this much memory and CPU, and then it will work. So the real question is, what is the limit for making software managed infrastructure? There is no limit to what you can imagine.
Right.
If you can imagine it, you're going to put it in a control loop. The hard part will be deciding the API for said thing. So some people say, oh, we're using Kubernetes to launch rockets. We're using Kubernetes on a cruise ship like that. We're using software to drive hardware.
Right.
Is not surprising to me.
Right.
So when I think about Kubernetes in those terms, there's no question. Even so much to the point where I tell people, do not design Kubernetes APIs first. If you're going to build a system, let's make a new system, right? The sky is the limit. Let's just use our mindset. We want to use Kubernetes to drive accounting software. We want to have Kubernetes make invoices.
Right.
Right? So we're going to define an API spec. I think the mistake people do is they limit themselves to the Kubernetes style API, very rigid.
Yeah.
They copy other APIs and limit themselves. What you want to do is have a good control loop that works for your system, define a really good API that works for you, your customer, what you're trying to do, and then add a Kubernetes API on top. Define your system first, because then you really get to the essence of Kubernetes. You have a definition of what you all support, and your control loop will read that and transform that to its own API. So if one day in the future, could be 100 years from now, you don't like Kubernetes anymore,
Yeah.
your control loop still works because it has its own API, it has its own type system. So we should be treating Kubernetes more like an HTTP API on top of an existing system than like the system itself.
Right.
So there's no limit.
It's a neat answer. Let's get into simplification of tech. It's part of our mission, obviously. With what we do, we're trying to create these instant magical, boop, and then you have a company, right? Company.yaml, you mentioned that one to me once, and it's stuck to me ever since. Just like desired state, how do I have, boom, a whole...
We should break down company.yaml.
Let's do.
After years of working on Kubernetes, talking to platform teams, processing Jira tickets myself in different capacities as a software developer, as an ops person, at the end of the day, I think a lot of our goals on the infrastructure side has always been to create an API for our teams.
Right.
For some people, that was Jira tickets.
Sure.
Right, and some people, I don't know if you've seen some people's Jira implementations, they got a ticket type for everything. You want access to a server? Open this ticket type. And those ticket types then become APIs with custom fields and their own SLAs to them. And you open one of those tickets, and depending on how sophisticated an organization is, I used to have control loops behind my Jira tickets.
Right.
And they would pull information out and run Puppet under the hood.
Right.
And so given that API boundary, when I say company.yaml, when someone says I want a VM, back to the thing you talked about, it taking 9 months to get a VM.
Sure.
I always put my head on the desk like, there's no world where it literally takes 9 months to get a VM. That's just a people process thing that you've chosen to allow to exist.
Right.
I guarantee you someone can go get sand, Intel can turn that into a wafer, make a CPU, give it to Dell, them fabricate a whole server in less than 9 months. You can click VMware
Right.
and get someone a server. So then company.yaml is like, how much information do I need to give you to get a VM?
Right.
And whatever that key value pair is, that's the API. And once you have that API, then the tool behind it doesn't matter as much.
Right.
Right? I can give you a YAML file. I can give you a Jira ticket. And either way, you're going to go through whatever process, and I should be able to get a thing with limited information. To me, that's the hardest part of this whole game.
Right.
What is the contract I'm willing to support?
Right. Right.
Sorry to throw you off with that, but
No, not
when
at
we
all.
say simplify, Kubernetes is cool, Linux is cool, TCP/IP, MTU settings on the network part of your stack, all that is cool, but it's uninteresting to someone that's just trying to get something done.
Right.
And so I think if you're a platform engineer and you're listening to this, your number one goal would be like, literally you can just ask this question. What is the necessary information I need to give people something that they want?
Right.
And if you're having trouble imagining how this works, because the infrastructure is complicated, think about an airline. They have runways and hangars. They have seats and planes and engines to maintain. But if you go to like a delta.com or Lufthansa, you type in, here's where I am, here's where I would like to go, the date, they might want to know who you are.
Right.
But once those things are captured, they show you what they support, you pick one, you pay, it hits save, and you show up to the airport. The plane is ready, it's fueled, you're not trying to get your pilot's license first, you're not taking a tutorial. How to fly the Airbus 388. Like, no!
Right.
The contract is clear, and you get what you want. And if you think about what a platform engineer is, it's kind of like that. People expect you to be more like the airline and less like Airbus.
Right. Right. We've been working on an open source project forever, right? And it's been it's been a really interesting firsthand experience to have a thing that you think is valuable, that you think is going to change companies, that you think could save them millions instantly, right? And to have that message and to try and take it to market and have to compete with the biggest and most well-funded organizations on the planet who are saying similar things in a different way with a more commercial element to it. And it's terribly difficult to break through. It's frankly, it's hard to get a microphone if you're just an open source project. How can that change in the industry? It seems incorrect that the industry has decided that a product pitch is a bad idea, if it's open source. How do we build an avenue into the industry so that a high-value open source project can get recognition?
I think so there's a couple of things that I think you have to break down in that. One, open source doesn't require anything. The only thing to be successful as an open source project is that you have a license and it's available and you define your contribution model.
Yep.
Once you get to that point, that's open source.
Yep.
This other stuff, business is what you're describing.
Sure, yeah.
You probably do what a lot of other people do. When you want to go eat somewhere, you look at some reviews. How many stars? Oh, 1 star. I don't know, man. Maybe we should just give them a shot.
Right.
Maybe these 7,023 people that have rated this place an average of 1 star don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
Right? And the inverse is true. When I see 7,000 people,
It's
4.5, reputation is very valuable. It's hard to earn it, and it's hard to compete with.
Yeah.
So when a small company shows up, I don't know if you're going to run out of VC funding. I don't know if you and your co-founder are going to get in an argument and throw away this whole thing because you can't agree on the splits.
Right.
Y'all haven't gone through that yet. Y'all still honeymoon period.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is not get in the middle of that right now. And the thing you're selling, we think we can go ask our big vendor we trust, can they deliver something similar?
Yep.
And for the right price, they'll say yes.
Yep.
That's the current dynamic.
Yeah.
And so I think the area you can compete on, number one, I think companies forget, we're talking about infrastructure.
Yeah.
I ain't gonna be the first one to drive over no bridge. I ain't seen no other car drive over this bridge yet. The people who built it have never driven over the bridge.
Right.
I'ma wait.
Right.
When y'all drive through a little bit, matter of fact, I needed to show up on Google Maps. Right now, this bridge is not even on Google Maps.
Right. Right.
So if I get on the bridge and fall in the water,
Whose fault is
that's
it?
my
Yeah.
fault.
Right.
Right? Now, once we get to a trust level, then I believe that you can stand behind your decision.
Yeah.
And so I've worked at big companies and small. Some of the largest companies in the world are saying, look, I'm not buying software from you.
Yeah.
I'm buying an insurance policy. I can go get the software from GitHub, run it myself, and never talk to you.
Yep.
I'm trying to figure out, will you be solvent when the time comes? If you cost me my business
Right.
an apology,
It's not going to cut it.
it's not going to cut it. I need to know you can stand behind it monetarily.
Right.
And the only companies right now that can sell insurance policies
Right.
are the ones that have enough capital
Right.
to make it whole. And I think most companies negotiate software deals based on the insurance policy first. This is why I think it's easier to sell services as a small company. That's a transaction. Come in, help my team get tasks done.
Yeah.
When it's done, I will call a no-name plumber because you're going to come in, either you're going to fix my toilet or not, and I'm going to pay you. I'm not going to buy your brand of toilet. We're going to stick to the known brands sold at the known stores, backed by warranty, but I'll let you come fix it.
Right.
So I think the way we do this as small companies is you got to build that reputation. Get that reputation. That's why I think the logo, the name, a little bit of goodwill.
Yep.
And I think the way open source is, what it has done for the smallest companies like HashiCorp.
Yep.
Mitchell and Armand built so much goodwill with Vagrant, then etcd or Console, and the brand started to get strong. Terraform became like an industry standard to the point where people would say, I can trust Terraform.
Yeah.
Maybe I can trust the company.
Right.
And then you know this as a business, those customer testimonials mean a lot.
Of course.
You talk to another company, it's like, how's it going for you? It's like, yo, it's been pretty solid. What happened when things went wrong? Their support was on point.
Yep.
It's great when you have an ecosystem behind you, so if not you, then someone else.
Yep.
You're right, the bar is set so high for what that means. But in many ways, I think the advantage the small company has is some companies are too small for the major providers.
Sure.
If you come in with 10 million even, they're like, you may not even get a sales rep.
Yeah.
And I think you all got to compete on really great service. So it breaks my heart when I hear startups say, we don't do services.
Yeah.
We're trying to do product-led growth with no customers.
Right.
You got to be white glove in the beginning, I believe, and then scale up to the point where it can be a bit more self-service. So that would be my advice, is that you got to compete on it. You got to grow your reputation, it takes time.
Yep.
Earn that reputation with real results, And I think you're going to have to do a little bit of white glove until the brand speaks for itself.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that advice. That's good advice. So we only have another minute. I have to ask you, you've been retired for a little bit from Google, and I think I speak for the entire cloud native ecosystem when I say that we are all glad that you didn't fully retire. It's been great to see you in the social sphere, dabbling in new tech. Just wanted to ask how life is, Kelsey. How are things?
The good news is I retired when I was 42, so I'm retired, not tired. So I still have all this energy.
Yeah.
And again, I always draw back to like the professional athletes, right? Some people retire after winning the championship.
Yeah.
Their body's still in good health. They're still in good health. They have some good financial resources to deal with. But what do you do with it? Do you really just throw it all away and pretend it never happened?
Right.
Or do you try to take all of that knowledge and just share it? Because at this point, it's really hard to just be purely excited for other people to be winning. But I think once you win your own championship, it's okay to watch other people win one without feeling any kind of way about it.
Yeah.
So I'm on that side of the trajectory. I'm learning how to just participate from afar. And I think involved in that, just being honest with people. Like when I do my talks now, I think at this point, people just want the honesty.
Of course.
They just want transparency. What are your thoughts about a thing? Because we know what you say is backed by this experience. We'll decide if it's helpful or not. And so I don't have to pretend.
Yeah.
So I think being retired means I get to only think about the things I actually care about, not things I have to care about in order to get paid.
Right.
And it's liberating in a way. I didn't have a bad experience. And I would say 80% of my career has been phenomenal.
I bet.
Phenomenal. But now I don't need to care about anything
Right.
unless I actually do.
That's neat. That's neat. Well, thank you for staying so engaged with the Kubernetes ecosystem, with the cloud native ecosystem. Thank you for coming on our show today. It's truly an honor to have you answer some questions and for all the advice.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.